Welcome back to the Unchained Binge Podcast, everybody. I'm Caley Fretz, joined today by our resident movie buff here at Escape Collective and TV buff, Kit Nicholson. Welcome.
Hello.
And joining us, replacing Johnny Long for the day, Dane Cash. Welcome.
I'm just a Johnny Long placeholder for today. And if you don't know what that is, that's another podcast from Escape Collective. Go check it out. Am I doing my job here?
Go check it out. I think most people that listen to this podcast probably are aware of what we do, but if you are not, head over to escapecollective.com. Check out what we do. We're about to head into wall-to-wall Tour de France coverage for the month of July. We got people on the ground. We'll have daily podcasts. Check all that stuff out. Let's get into our second watching of the Unchained Binge Podcast. We are in Season 2, Episode 2, The Third Man.
Well, Episode 2 centers around rivalry and mental games, pitching at first Ben O'Connor against Jai Hindley, the two Aussie GC contenders from Perth, with a particular focus on Stage 5 of the tour. Then we return to the battle for yellow and the early toing and froing between Vingegaard and Pogačar.
So what are the main talking points that came out of this episode? This is the Aussie episode. Like this is in fact, if you'd asked me prior to the whole thing coming out, prior to watching this, whether we would have an Aussie episode, I probably would have said no. This is one of those kind of funny storylines where on the ground last year, or in our coverage last year, this sort of battle between the Australians was not really top of mind, right? And I say that as a company with quite a few Australian staff. You know, actually, technically our headquarters is in Melbourne, and nonetheless, this is not a storyline that I think most of us were focused on last year, which makes it in some ways kind of interesting because we got a bunch of insight into something that we weren't necessarily seeing in real time last year. But it also feels not manufactured, but it feels like they're taking a bit of drama that, again, was not that big of a deal in real time and kind of elevating it for the purposes of this show. So let's start with the characters that are kind of either introduced or really fleshed out in this episode. So the first is we go a lot deeper on Ben O'Connor. Can one of you give me a bit more context on Ben that beyond what we get in the show?
I think, well, there's a couple of things at play with Ben O'Connor here. First of all, is that he was a major character last year, in last year's Unchained, in which we saw him suffering through some health stuff, injuries, and I think last year you got a sense that he was having a rough time of it. I felt like he was a pretty sympathetic character in Season 1. Watching the interplay between this team, a French team, and because they're a French team, they're getting maybe a little bit extra focus in this French-produced docuseries. You get that interplay last year. This year he comes in, you know, we're talking about a rider who had finished fourth at the Tour de France at one point. It wasn't a particularly close fourth, but it was still just off the podium.
Still fourth.
You know, and so this is a French team that has this rider that they want to put him on the podium. They seem to believe this is a real possibility. And this is sort of like, okay, last year didn't work out. Let's give it another go. So you got the context with O'Connor in that he's a returning character. He's not a brand new character to watchers of this show.
So the other AG2R related character is another one that we spent quite a bit of time with in Season 1, which is Julien Gildy, which is who is the director sportif at AG2R. He's the head director. Unusually for, I guess, head directors or director sportifs at all in pro cycling, he wasn't a really high level pro himself. He sort of came up. This was like always his dream job. He learned how to do it. He learned the tactics. He learned all this stuff. He was a bike racer at some point, but I think they touched on that in Season 1 more so than Season 2 here. What else do we know about Julien? I mean, he was not necessarily portrayed super positively last year.
I think it was portrayed as a pretty enigmatic character, a bit of eccentric as well. And I mean, you mentioned him having been a bike racer, but not at a particularly prolific level, let's say. But he seems to, well, certainly we found last year that he seems to live vicariously through his riders now, and he gets tattoos of their major achievements. He's got, I think, the team prize on the podium on some part of his body. So that, you know, there's 8 or 9 riders lined up along a podium, depending on which year it was. So it's not the most aesthetically pleasing tattoo, maybe, but it is something that he really wants to commemorate. And so there's that interesting sort of character that you've got at the head of this team, and you see him offset with Ben O'Connor, and it's a great kind of little strange double act.
One thing that I really enjoy about the show is that it often uses DSs or managers, bosses of the team, whatever, to be a voice in a way that they can be, because the riders are literally in the bike race. So you get the team car perspective so often, because that is the only way that they can give you any kind of narration or context. Because obviously Ben O'Connor can't say too much. I mean, he talks into his microphone, but it's generally going to be the DSs and the managers, the team bosses, that you're going to get a lot of the exposition from, a lot of the narration. And I think that's a really great window into a side of the sport that you just don't really get if you're a fan watching on TV. And it's cool to see, because if you're Ben O'Connor, or if you're any rider, the DS and the team boss, you're constantly in conversation with these people. They are so important to what's happening in every race behind the scenes, but the fans don't necessarily get that much exposure to them. And so that's a really nice aspect of this show, is that it gives you the Julien Jordis, etc., all these people, for good and bad.
If we move down the line here, we got another Aussie, and this is it's sort of the source of, I guess, the tension in this episode, which is the sort of rivalry between these two Perth-born, actually I don't know if they were born there, grew up in Perth, Australia, bike racers, two very, very, very good bike racers. So we've got Ben O'Connor, obviously, but the other one is Jai Hindley, the Giro d'Italia champion. He is either portrayed, or it actually is, I don't know, quite a bit more smooth.
A bit more cool
than Ben O'Connor.
Cool,
a bit more cool
cucumber. Yeah.
Cool cucumber. And he really, there's a pretty distinct split between these two characters in this show, and it also kind of creates a bit of tension. That, again, this is a tension that I don't think most of us were really particularly aware of. This sort of like intra-Aussie rivalry that was happening at this Tour de France that, again, was not something that was showing up in media elsewhere, but apparently, at the very least, was very important to Ben O'Connor. Unclear how important it was to Jai Hindley.
Yeah, I think that's what keeps it distinct from other sort of manufactured controversy that the show does sometimes. Sometimes the show just creates melodrama where it isn't. In this case, it really seemed like, at least for Ben O'Connor, this was important. Yeah. Who knows if literally anyone else cared, but he cared. And so that made it actually pretty interesting to watch.
Well, and the last character that we wanted to sort of just talk through really briefly here was Ralph Denk, who is the manager of the Bora Hansgrohe team. Interestingly, and kind of hilariously, so the Unchained production crew followed Bora around at the 2022 Tour de France for the first episode of Unchained, but basically the team did absolutely nothing of interest, and so they didn't even make the final cut. Like, there was no episode with any significant amount of Bora in it. So they literally had they had camera people following them around for a whole month, nothing, right? So good for Bora. They've made it to the show this time. And part of the reason they have is because, Jai Hindley gets the yellow jersey for a day. That's fantastic. And Ralph Denk is this very interesting character because he's a German guy, comes across as sort of this combination of very uncomfortable when they ask him to kind of do a bit of acting, and very earnest, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But the other bit of context I think is important with Ralph Denk, and this is after the show is recorded. So since then, Red Bull has come on with Bora Hansgrohe. And so Ralph Denk has sort of put this whole deal together that Red Bull now owns a portion of that team. Just sort of getting a bit of personality from him in this show, plus the times that I've spoken with him, in scrums and stuff at the Tour de France. That's a really interesting mix for me. Like, he doesn't necessarily, I wouldn't have put him at the top of my list to strike a deal with Red Bull. And yet, here we are today with that as the reality. Like, if anyone out there is going to be watching the 2024 Tour de France, you're going to see Red Bull on those jerseys, right? That's something that has changed from last year. Did you guys have anything else on Ralph that you think is worth informing folks of?
Well, I think it's worth pointing out that he founded this team a little more than a decade ago. They were a smaller team at first. They were NetApp at the time, and they rose through the ranks over time. They went and signed then superstar Peter Sagan, made their way to the World Tour, and now, with Red Bull.
Sam Bennett as well.
Sam Bennett, yeah. Then over the years, they've become a pretty successful team, and I think it's really cool to see Ralph Denk, who is the guy who kind of started all of this. Not kind of, he did. He founded all of this. Getting emotional about Jai Hindley, doing something at the Tour. This whole project, this whole team is Ralph Denk founded. and that's cool to see. And it's this year, 2024, is like the next step in that evolution, and it's a big change from, oh, it's this team that this guy right here on the screen, he founded and he built it up from the ground up. And by the time, next year's Tour de France documentary rolls out, it's going to be the Red Bull team. And it'll be a little bit different from this formerly small squad that they're scrappy. Next year, or this year, actually, it's Primož Roglič and it's Red Bull, and it's a big change.
Yeah. He mentions the fact that they have a lot less money than everybody else, right? Like that's actually mentioned in the show. And that, yes, it was true in 2023, not necessarily going to be true from 2024.
Yeah, moving forward.
It's also, I think, worth just bearing him in mind. And, certainly in his portrayal of in the show, he seems like a very, very different character to who we're very used to as CEOs and general managers of these teams. We're going to meet some others in future episodes who couldn't really be much more, they couldn't be further at the opposite extreme than Dane comes across in this episode.
I thought it was really great that we saw some emotion from him.
Definitely.
You could see how much it meant to him in a way that I personally, in my interactions or just being around him at various press conferences, I'm mostly thinking of like back when everybody would go to the Peter Sagan press conferences because he was Peter Sagan. Ralph Denk, wasn't somebody that I feel like I got a lot out of, or just didn't really feel like I got a lot of emotion or. And maybe there's a little bit of a language barrier there. We get to see him speaking in German a lot in the doc. And
his English is fine though.
Yeah, everyone speaks in their native language, which is something I really like about the show. But yeah, anyway,
I think it's a really smart thing that they do. Yeah. In fact, we can let's leave Ralph Denk behind because he's just an interesting character, and it's sort of somebody we could provide a little bit more context on because they definitely did not flesh him out particularly. They didn't need to, right? Within the show. Let's return to kind of the big crux of this episode, right? Which was this Aussie thing that was happening. So if we kind of take this Aussie rivalry at face value, let's talk a little bit about like where these two riders were coming from ahead of the tour, whether we think that that's a sort of a valid storyline, and then a little bit about, I don't know, how it plays out within the episode.
Well, O'Connor and Hindley had both gone to the Dauphiné, which is the biggest pre-tour warm-up race. It's run by the same organization as well. And O'Connor came third, Hindley behind in fourth. But then, if you go back a bit further, Hindley, who was in his first year with Bora Hansgrohe, he won the Giro d'Italia, which is, just realized who's on this podcast. I was going to say it's a second Grand Tour behind the Tour de France, maybe. Dane might disagree, but anyway, he beat some pretty decent competition at the Giro, and he's a proven Grand Tour stage racer. And we mentioned earlier that O'Connor has come fourth at the Tour de France before, but in that year that he came fourth, he was pretty much out of the GC picture until he got into a breakaway, and that's how he got back up into the top 5 of the GC. And that's a very different way to race for GC than the traditional way that he's been trying to do for the past 3 years. I don't know, I feel like we talk about him a little bit less, but he seems to be the sort of rider who peaks for a single event a bit more than maybe O'Connor is either want to do or forced to do by programs and team management. But Hindley seems to be a bit more of a kind of point and shoot rather than let's be consistent.
I think it's fair to say he's a significantly more legit GC contender than
I would agree.
O'Connor, even though I don't know that the show portrays them in that way at first. Maybe that's because O'Connor races for a French team.
And I don't think O'Connor would agree.
Probably not.
Let's talk a little bit. Let's talk about this sort of like this crux moment, right? So what happens is O'Connor gets dropped. This is the day that Jai Hindley ends up taking the yellow jersey, right? Hindley's on a great day. O'Connor gets dropped. O'Connor's AG2R team continues to pull. Now, what is kind of left out of this is that they're pulling for Felix Gall, who is their other guy, right? He's not the team leader, but he's still a very good bike racer, and he's still up there, and he still could do something in that particular stage.
And he had just won a stage at the Tour de Suisse a week before, a big
mountain stage. Yeah, he'd struggled on the GC there, but he had worn the yellow jersey for a day, and he'd won a really good stage. So he was definitely, going to be a protected rider.
Spoiler alert: we do know that Felix Gall is worth riding for at the Tour de France.
Yes.
Let's put it,
Yes. Spoiler.
Well, if we even get to see that, we don't know that we're going to get to see stage 17.
So we get this moment where O'Connor's dropped. So he's on a bad day, but he's livid that his team keeps pulling, keeps riding. As far as he's concerned, they're riding for Jai Hindley, right? Who he has this sort of odd Australian rivalry thing with. And he is pissed, right? Like he's pissed off at his director. He's pissed off. Interestingly, he's got
his own coach.
Stephen Bassett. He's got his own coach. Yeah. They're kind of talking through this stuff. So is this legit? I think is the big question, because this is the source of drama for the whole episode. And is this legit?
I think to as you've just mentioned, his coaches, I would just, in defense of O'Connor, and I don't necessarily, and he lost time, as he also notes, he lost a lot of time, and that sucked too. But when he was warming down and he heard that Hindley was in the yellow jersey, he initially thought that was cool. But then his coach fed him the information. That's what it seemed. He fed him the sole nugget of information that AG2R had been pulling for Hindley. He didn't mention that we saw that Felix Gull had been in there too. And so that moment of realization, the moment of reaction that Hindley had, O'Connor had on the turbo, was potentially based on not the full story, not all the information.
Yeah. Stephen Barrett is the
Stephen Barrett. That's
his coach, I guess. And I thought in general Barrett came across as being a pretty friendly and calming force, mediator. Mostly. Other than that
The language thing on this team is really interesting to me as well. Where so in the first season, Julien Gildy doesn't speak much English, or at least doesn't kind of refuses to speak much English, and Ben O'Connor makes a lot of like, I don't understand what you're saying faces, right? When they're doing stuff in French. And O'Connor's French has gotten better throughout this, so he can definitely communicate in French like he wasn't able to at first. But they switch all the time, right? So like, kind of the more animated they get, the more likely they are to step into their native language so they can use the words, right? In fact, there's actually at one point, I think it's Jurdy that tells O'Connor, switch to English so you can find the words, right? Which is just a funny dynamic within this team, because I'd say most teams within the World Tour these days, English is the language, right? Even the only exceptions would be Movistar is definitely very Spanish still. The two French teams are still pretty French. That's it.
Yeah.
all the other teams speak English, right? And even AG2R, and this would not have been true even sort of 5, 6, 7 years ago, even they're speaking a lot of English internally. Obviously, the sort of managers' meetings in the morning are still in French and things like that. But that's just a little sort of side tidbit that I personally found quite interesting. But you've got like, Felix Gall, right, who's not a native French speaker. He's from Austria, speaks great English and definitely speaks some French. But that's why these teams are starting to all just transition into being English language teams, basically. So
let's talk about how O'Connor came across, because that's one of the biggest talking points of this episode, isn't it?
I think, especially in the context of how he came across in a sympathetic fashion last year, I thought it was a stark contrast this year to see him. Well, a few things. I mean, first of all, he seemed, the whole him being angry about AG2R pulling, to me, was very silly. I mean, it's like, there's no reason to be mad about that at all. That's bike racing. It's how it works. And I think it doesn't come across well for O'Connor. And then he also seems to be a bit more willing to express his frustrations in a less than great way than I had realized with the team. We saw that a couple of times. We saw it. First of all, he's frustrated at himself, which fine, I get that. But then also when he's livid about them pulling for, as he saw it, pulling for Jai Hindley, it's like, I don't think anyone else in the whole world cared about that, but he did, and it just doesn't.
No, this is what I mean. This is a storyline that, like, I remember covering this particular day. And, at the end of each stage, you're kind of hunting around for storylines, right? You're like, you're looking for narrative. You're looking for people to talk to. If I had been aware of this, it's something we would have chased down, right?
It is potential. Yeah,
it's quite interesting, but it was not anywhere else, which is actually kind of cool. Like, this series has not always shown us much that we didn't already know, and assuming this is being portrayed correctly, this is a good example of this show showing us something that digs a bit deeper on what we actually watched day of.
You also get to see, on that note, you get to see something that those of us who have covered a lot of bike races have experienced probably multiple times. You get to see it from the rider's perspective, and that is, I mean, Caley, I'm sure you have stood outside of many a team bus having been told that you'll be able to interview someone, whether it was the rider or their press officer who told you that. And then they didn't show. And you got to see the writer's perspective of this, which is they had a shit day. They don't want to talk to anybody. And, you get it a little bit. And as much as I think O'Connor doesn't come across in a positive way, you do get to see that side of it. I thought that was cool to see him say, no, I'm not doing any interviews today. Because I've been outside of the bus in that, parking lot waiting to talk to someone and have it not happen.
The funny thing about that situation is they can see you. Right? Like they can see out of the bus, but we can't see into the bus. So we're just standing out there. Like I want to just hold up a sign that says like, I don't really want to talk to you either, but please come out. I have a job.
I promise I will be nice.
I promise I'll be nice. No mean questions. Like 30 seconds only. Like I something to get them.
Won't ask about today.
The bus. Yeah, exactly.
It's interesting because I do see this perspective now that I've spoken to these guys and seen what people were saying on our Discord. And I think by the time when I was looking at Discord, the Australians hadn't woken up yet, which I think was quite an interesting point because this was the universal, it seemed, agreement was that O'Connor didn't come across well. Now, when I was watching it, and maybe because I'm a big softie, which I don't think I am necessarily, but maybe that's the case.
Big softie.
Yeah, no stiff upper lip here. I thought, okay, yeah, there's a lot of personal story here, a lot of emotion, and we've seen that in the earlier episode as well. He seems to, it started with him getting the news of Maida in the first episode, which was pretty shocking, really. That they were allowed to even show that and keep recording. But anyway, I don't know. I mean,
so I'll just pause on that real quick, and the promise of these shows, we are going to go a little bit deep, so apologies. This is not like on the original run sheet, but I think that's something that's worth touching on. There was a bit of chatter in our Discord, and again, just I guess to mention it or to plug it for those of you that are not fully aware of what Escape Collective is. Our members, we have a members only Discord, so the chat about all this sort of stuff regularly, and it's a pretty cool place to be. There's lots of chatter about Unchained in that Discord at the moment, and one of the things that kind of came up a couple times was people feeling it was like almost irresponsible to show moments like that, or that it was taking advantage in some way to show moments like that. And I guess I would push back on that because it adds a lot of power to the show. And to return to what I was saying about episode 1, I think it doesn't feel gratuitous to me because it's true, right? Like it's truly setting the stakes of this sport that is a very, very dangerous sport. And the stakes are very, very high, both on a personal, professional, and sort of team level. And I think not including moments like that would be the wrong decision. I think that you need to have those real moments like that. And, the fact that we got to see Ben O'Connor's actual reaction to this horrifying thing that had happened, right? Like he knew Gino pretty well, I think is very valuable to us as a viewership. And it's also valuable for turning him into a 3-dimensional character, right? Because the other thing is we're about to find out that he's maybe not the best at handling professional adversity, but I do have a little bit more empathy for him because of watching that moment. And I think that is important for sort of the full rounding effect of him as a human being, because he is a human being, not just a bike racer.
I totally agree with that. I feel like he came away in a less positive light because of all the stuff with Hindley, but overall, I think the biggest takeaway is just he is human. And we got to see a bunch of different sides of him. And I think that was a really great, the totality of it all is a great reason to watch this show, because you get all of these different sides of
I think that's something that is a major improvement based following last year's season. I think this series, this year's season has really dug into those characters a lot more, and we're getting to see many more sides of them. And it's, they're bringing in their spouses, their partners, their children even, and I think that really, really adds to the storyline and to the investment in the show. Before we leave O'Connor, which I guess we probably ought to do based on how long we've been going, I would just like to add just to my, somewhat, I do believe in some of this defense. It is somewhat fabricated. However, I would say that I felt it was very unfortunate, and I was very much on O'Connor's side, or at least leaning further that way, when he kept being told, just smile, it's okay. It's verging on gaslighting. It's like, yeah, you felt this way, but it's not the case. And that's not really cool. I didn't like that.
I mean, the team doesn't come across particularly well
no.
either in any of this, right? Like, I think that's the reality. So last year in season 1, tons of sympathy for Ben O'Connor because it looked like his team was an absolute shit show.
To add the context, he got injured and he was not forced because he had to get on the bike, but it was a case of you will keep going the Tour de France. This is the Tour de France. Sponsors pay for you.
An old school mindset, a pretty old school and unsavory mindset. And then this year, I think it's clear that maybe there's a bit of blame to go around on both sides. I did take a moment to reach out to, I'll just describe them as an individual from the Perth cycling scene, because both O'Connor and Jai Hindley are from the Perth cycling scene, Perth, Australia, and asked what this individual thought of the portrayal of these two riders that this person has known since they were 13, 12 years old. His rough answer, I'm going to paraphrase here, it was basically Jai is Jai, right? Like there's no BS, there's no persona. What we saw from Jai Hindley in this episode is exactly the way that he is in real life. And he said that Ben O'Connor is definitely known as a slightly more difficult character, but he does think that he was sort of that was drummed up a little bit, or at the very least, they sort of cherry picked his worst moments, right? That in general, he's more level headed than he would appear in this show, but that he's also wasn't entirely incorrect, right? Like wasn't entirely manufactured, which I thought was an interesting bit of perspective. And I guess, does help me kind of look at the show and say, okay, well, as long as they're not fully inventing a bad guy here, which it kind of felt like they were doing a couple times in season 1, then I think, we can kind of take the show so far at face value and understand it.
I thought on the bad guy note, Caley or Kit, you had pointed out when we were planning that the music for the initial introduction of Jai Hindley was
I described it. I mean, when I think it was on my second watch actually, but when Jai is first introduced, well, not first introduced, but when he gets the limelight for the first time, there was this kind of Hans Zimmer submarine sort of soundscape that made me that was quite kind of cinematically, here's the villain. And then by the episode, it's almost like, I mean, obviously they edited it with the whole arc in mind, but it felt like they tried so hard to make Jai Hindley seem like a bad guy and failed because
I feel like it took like 5 seconds for it to be like, exactly. Oh no, this guy's great. He's awesome.
Exactly,
he's charismatic. And we've said he's cool as a cucumber. He was talking early on about his hopes and dreams, and then even when it didn't work out, I mean, he first of all, he did win the stage and take yellow, so it did work out. But then later losing it, he's still cool as a cucumber about it.
I think he's got a future in audiobooks if he wants it. I like listening to his voice.
Same. Yep.
I'm kind of surprised that made it to the edit, right? You're watching this thing back and you're like, oh, we just tried to make this guy a villain, and then literally 4.5 seconds later, it turns out he seems really nice.
I mean, that's just my deep.
So maybe we should.
You know what I'm like.
No, but it's true. We have to assume that musical choices in this show were not accidental, right? So there was intent behind that, and then maybe the intent was also that it would immediately flip on its head, that it was a moment of kind of take you on a bit of an emotional roller coaster with these two. Let's get into single biggest thing we learned from this episode, and we can include both the O'Connor Jai rivalry. The other sort of storyline in this was we did get a bit of Pogacar Vingegaard back and forth. I think that we're not going to spend a ton of time on that in this episode because we know that there's a lot more coming, right? There's 6 more episodes. There's going to be more focus on those two. But yeah, what was the single biggest thing that we learned from this episode?
I don't know that there's a single biggest thing. I mean, it's difficult to say, as you say, knowing what happens, what we saw live last year. What's great about this show and that we've talked about before is that you get, and earlier this episode, you get the insight into the staff around the riders, not just what you see on the screen while the race is going on. And so with that, you've got, in this episode, O'Connor's coach. And that's both a kind of an interesting note for people who aren't so familiar with cycling, and that some big name riders will have their own coach, which quite often they bring with them from another team or they develop a relationship with. Obviously, they both speak the same first language, so that's a good plus for O'Connor on a French team. Barrett probably does coach another rider or two. I mean, he was with Nance Peters at the training camp in the first episode. So yeah, there's that sort of interesting dynamic that you've got that you don't necessarily see outside of this sort of show. But then, like I said, I don't know if this is something that we necessarily learned, but the way that it's portrayed there's the kind of O'Connor and Barrett versus the team thing that I saw, which I saw as the kind of objective viewer rather than Kate Nicholson, psyching journalist.
Dane?
I think I want to touch a little bit on the Visma Lisa Blake side of things, because they were a big part of the episode, even though I know we're going to talk about more about that, because obviously they're going to be a major player moving forward. But a couple of things stood out to me from the Visma Lisa Blake perspective that we got. Two things in particular that they're both related. One is we saw sort of a building block that will be fleshed out more, but we saw a building block of this idea that Visma Lisa Blake wants to win everything. When Vingago didn't catch Hindley, they were pissed.
Yeah.
And it's like, can't let somebody else win once? But no, they can't do that. They were not happy that Vingago didn't catch Hindley. He's, we all know that he's Jonas Vingago. He's going to win a lot. He's the GC favorite, but even just that one stage getting away and Wout van Aert not getting as many stage wins as he wanted, that made them angry. They want to win everything. And then related to this is the mouthpiece for these perspectives is Grisha Nierman, who to me is the star of the show. He is the best thing about Unchained, for better or worse. Everything he says makes me laugh. Yeah. So Grisha Nierman,
especially 4-letter words.
Yes.
Fucking legend, Jonas. You're a fucking legend.
Non-native English speakers using English swear words. Excellent.
Well, I mean, yeah, the Dutch
I've also been learning lots of.
I've been
learning lots of foreign language swear words in this show too, which is really handy. Like I come previously equipped with some French, Italian, and Spanish swear words, but I'm learning Dutch swear words from, in particular. Actually, we're getting ahead of ourselves here, but there's a future episode with a lot of Alpecin de Koenig swearing, so a lot of Dutch swearing. I think that's very handy. That's something that, that's a real takeaway that we can take out of the show is all of us now can swear in 7 different languages. couple small things. Maybe these are more Easter egg kind of category than anything. Ralph Denk is big softy.
Yeah.
I think that we mentioned this previously, but he seems like a big softy. Also, the German word for team will make me giggle until the end of my days, which is Mannschaft. And because that's
Denk.
I'm just exceptionally immature. Ben O'Connor hates power meters. Why did you put that in there?
Just because it was funny. It was, and it goes back to what Dane was saying about the exclamations that he made repeatedly throughout the episode. And Wout van Aert makes a lot of shouty noises as well, as do a lot of the sprinters. But yeah, I found that an interesting addition to the beginning of the episode, in that O'Connor was just shown shouting at his computer while on a training ride.
To the point about Van Aert, I think another thing that this show does really well that brings something to the viewers that, again, if you've ever been at a bike race, you've been around this, and it's cool that the show brings this to viewers at home. The noises of riders who are emotional about stuff, especially the Belgians. Yeah. They're the ones who often are making noises that are not actually words. You hear so much of that everywhere you go at a bike race. Just a lot of that kind of sound. There's
this funny sort of like European cycling language, right? It's like it's not actually any one language. Yeah. It's a bit of Dutch. It's a lot of English. It's a bit of French.
Sensations.
Like there's this sort of these, like there's the way that things are said, particularly like in English, but it's not actually English, right? It's like either directly translated out of some other language. It's not words that we would actually use. They are technically English words, but they are not in an order that we would ever actually use them. All right, we're going to wrap up today's episode with some awards. We like to do a little awards here. So we have taken the time to name these. We're going to kick off with the Golden Raspberry, the Razzie Award. Kit, just for anybody who's not aware of what this is an actual award that exists in real life that we're stealing.
Yeah. So everyone's heard of the Oscars, the Academy Awards in film. I think it's nearly always, if not always, on the same night. There is another award show which isn't televised, and at least until recently was not very well attended, apart from the people who were in on the joke. But they're fondly known as the Razzies, basically the opposite of the Oscars, so the worst performance of the year. Famously, Sandra Bullock turned up to both shows one year because she won an Oscar and a Razzie in the same season. So, yeah.
Love it. So we are going to be handing out Razzies for each episode, which is the worst acting in a particular episode. And there is a fair amount of acting that happens in these. That tends to happen from kind of weirdly and unfortunately, a lot of the acting is coming from writers' partners. Which I think is the reason I say unfortunate is because these people are not actors, and they're putting him in this situation where they're kind of forced to act, and Netflix is clearly asking them to
questions.
Yeah, telling them to ask questions that feed some narrative, and it doesn't really work for me. So we're gonna try not to just like make fun of writers' partners for not being actors, because they're not actors. We like to punch up, right? So in the spirit of punching up, the winner of the Razzie for episode 2 is Ralph Denk on the bus, right?
Yeah, I mean,
like we can kind of make fun of a GM more so than
and I think it's like you said, like we said at the beginning, it was a case of he's not particularly comfortable when he's being told to say something in front of the camera. If it's candid, then fine. But if he's being told to reenact part of a briefing that they've already done, that he has to give some exposition, then it's a bit of it's tough.
And I think we got to be specific about that, because there's other parts in the episode where we got to see very earnest Ralph Denk being emotional, and that's not acting as far as we can tell.
No.
If it is, he is a great actor, because tears with the yellow jersey. It's specifically when clearly a producer has said, "Hey, we need exposition. Go give us some," and act like you're telling writers these things that they haven't heard yet.
Yeah. And it doesn't really work. Anyway, the Golden Razzie to Ralph Denk this episode. The Melodrama Award, we're going to give that one to... Do we think Grisha Nierman laughing at
I think that's the
Ben O'Connor?
I thought that was the best moment of the episode, because to me,
this is also probably
a cut that is not real. But you get to see when Ben O'Connor gets dropped, there's like, Visma doing Visma things, pushing the pace, and they cut to Grisha Nierman just laughing. Who's
the director of Visma, right?
Yeah, so he's the one in the car. It's as if he's laughing at Ben O'Connor for being dropped. I think what we're probably seeing is him laughing at how good his own team is. Maybe in that moment, maybe not. Who knows?
Maybe not.
But the way that it's cut, it's like Grisha Nierman, Ben O'Connor got dropped.
I think the key point here is, and this is meant as no slight on Ben O'Connor or AG2R. Grisha Nierman doesn't care.
Yeah.
Nope.
About Ben O'Connor or AG2R. And I say that because the only rider / team that he cares about is Tadej Pogacar and UAE, right? So he's not even going to waste giggles on AG2R and Ben O'Connor. And so this was probably factually incorrect. And so therefore, the Melodrama Award to essentially the director of the show, I guess, goes for that particular moment. The Smooth Operator Award. I think this is a 50-50 between, again, Grisha Nierman, who is a fantastic character in this show, and Jai Hindley. What do you guys think?
I think we should give it to Jai Hindley, because I expect we're going to see more of Grisha Nierman.
Nierman will have more.
Yeah.
I mean, Hindley
He'll be smooth once again.
Yeah. I think
Hindley was great.
Yep.
He was, he just comes across really, really well. And again, to sort of back that up with both my secret Perth source, as well as the fact that I've spoken with the guy many, many times, he is that. That's who he is. And I think that's a pretty accurate representation of him. And finally, the most prestigious award in all of our awards, the Jonathan Vaughters Understanding the Assignment Award, which in episode 1 went to Jonathan Vaughters. He won his own award. Congratulations, JV. In this case, the Jonathan Vaughters Understanding the Assignment Award goes to Julien Jourdi.
Yeah. I mean, he's always got a great quote. Whether he's telling Ben O'Connor everything's fine and that he should just smile, or just the fact that it's the French team of it all. I think he stood out for me.
It's funny that I think
he knows how to make good TV.
It's like there's so many cases in which a person comes across in a not great way, and yet it's awesome TV. So it's like, I wish you weren't this way personally, but also I love that you're this way because it makes it fun to watch.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a tiny little bit of sort of reality TV chucked in the middle of it there. All right, the JV Understanding the Assignment Award to Julien Jourdi. Congratulations, Julien.
I hope you get it tattooed to your chest.
we genuinely hope that. All right, that's it for us for this episode. We'll, of course, be back with a big chat around episode 3, No Mercy. So apparently there's going to be no mercy in the next episode. As always, I must remind you, Escape Collective is entirely funded by our members. That means if you're listening to this, you like what we do, you like this podcast, you want to make sure that you don't hit a paywall with all of our fantastic content coming during the Tour de France, head over to escapecollective.com/member. Sign up now. All right. Thanks for joining, Kit.
Yeah. Always good.
I mean, don't sound so excited about
I was not expecting to have to talk again.
She's like pushing her microphone away. I'm out of here. Thank you for joining, Dane. You subbed in for quite well for Johnny, I would say.
Well, that's
the
good,
accent
I'm about to do it
was
one more time,
superb.
So I hope that's yeah.
Is this the trio for episode 3?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Let's do it. All right. So all 3 of us will be back in a couple days with a deep dive into episode 3 of Unchained. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.